Grounded. That was the first word my dad flung across the long banquet table, sharp as broken glass, landing right between my ribs. You are grounded until you apologize to your sister. He delivered it with the same tone he used years ago when I borrowed his car, without asking. The absurdity of that comparison almost made me laugh. Almost. Instead, I sat there perfectly still while a room full of people enjoyed the small spectacle of a grown woman being disciplined like a difficult teenager. If you have ever wondered what humiliation sounds like, I can tell you. It sounds like polite laughter over champagne glasses. My dad liked control, liked order, liked the feeling that he knew exactly where everyone in his orbit stood, especially me. And that night at the country club on West Shore Drive in Milwaukee, he thought he had reestablished that order. He thought he had won. I doubt he realized he had just triggered a chain reaction that would cost him everything he had spent a lifetime building. Everything. I remember the lights first, the heavy chandeliers reflecting off polished floors, the faint clink of crystal, the scent of roasted rosemary chicken drifting through the room, the cold air from the entry doors sweeping in each time another guest arrived. It was New Year's Eve, and the members of the Whitlock Industrial Group Inner Circle were spread around the private dining hall. My dad thrived in rooms like that, where people paused their conversations when he walked by. My mom floated at his side, perfectly styled, carefully smiling. Elena, my older sister, was already on her second glass of wine, cheeks pink, talking animatedly to one of the managers. And Ryan, her husband, stood near the bar, watching everyone with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he had every angle covered. He noticed my briefcase before he noticed me. It was leaning on the leg of my chair, a simple black case with worn edges from too many nights in too many federal offices. He saw the corner of a packet inside when I shifted my foot, a sliver of white stamped with bold federal lettering. It took less than a second for recognition to register on his face, less than a second for his expression to tighten before smoothing back into something polite. But I saw it. I cataloged details for a living. That flicker alone told me what I needed to know. Ryan understood exactly what I had in that case, and exactly how dangerous it was for him. He walked toward me with a practiced smile, the kind of smile you give a child who is about to ruin dinner with an inconvenient truth. He put a hand on the back of my chair, leaning just close enough to make it seem like he was checking on his sister-in-law. "You look tense," he said quietly. "Everything is all right." His voice carried the manufactured concern of a man who had rehearsed empathy in front of a mirror. I said I was fine. That was all. No explanation, no invitation. That was apparently enough. Mom must have overheard him because she drifted toward us, hand lightly touching his shoulder in the kind of gesture she rarely gave her own daughters. "Are you feeling overwhelmed again, Maya? You have been under a lot of stress. Maybe you should take a break." Again. The word hung there. A suggestion that I had some sort of pattern, a documented weakness. My dad caught only the last part as he approached, but that was enough fuel for him. "This is supposed to be a celebration," he said loudly enough for the two nearest tables to hear. "I would appreciate it if you don't start anything tonight." Start anything. I was sitting, breathing, existing. Ryan, my brother-in-law, looked down with a sympathetic tilt of his head, one I am sure he practiced with similar prey. "I am worried about you," he said to me. "You have been so on edge. Maybe talk to someone, a professional." He delivered it gently for maximum sting, like being stabbed with a velvet-covered knife. I knew exactly what he was doing. Undermining credibility is the first step in neutralizing a threat. And a forensic accountant with a 2-year federal investigation in her briefcase was a threat he needed gone. Elena, my sister, drifted over, completely unaware of the subtext. Or maybe selectively unaware. She said something about me ruining the mood last Thanksgiving, something about me always turning everything into an interrogation. It was careless, a little cruel, but she was drunk, and I am not sure it would have mattered anyway. Then my dad straightened his shoulders. I have seen that stance my entire life. The stance that usually came before a lecture about responsibility or gratitude or the importance of not embarrassing him in public. He lifted his chin and aimed his disappointment at me with surgical precision. "You are grounded until you apologize to your sister." A grown woman in a room of executives, lawyers, neighbors, donors, An extended family, being grounded. I could practically hear the headlines. Someone at the surrounding table laughed. Then someone else joined in, not mean-spirited, just amused, as if the whole thing were a harmless family joke. But it wasn't harmless. It was a crack in the foundation. A public confirmation that he believed Ryan, that he saw me as emotional, unstable, dramatic. A liability. He never asked what was in my briefcase. Never wondered why his forensic accountant daughter had driven 2 hours from Chicago to Milwaukee with quiet urgency and skipped the bar entirely. At that moment, I realized something cold and practical. My dad only trusted information that came from people who told him exactly what he wanted to hear. And I had spent my entire life telling him the truth. "All right," I said, "just that. No fight, no raised voice, no explanation." My hands were steady, which surprised me. My heartbeat was normal. Everything inside me went quiet, as if someone had finally closed a door to a room I should never have walked into in the first place. I caught Ryan watching me from the bar again. This time his smile was thinner. He thought he had neutralized the threat. He thought I was out of the way. What he did not know was that the only thing keeping him safe up to that point was my attempt to save my dad from the legal fallout that would inevitably land on him once the federal investigation went public. My cooperation package, tucked in that briefcase, was the only shield my dad had left. But when the plates were cleared and the music softened, my dad placed his hand on my shoulder and quietly informed me that I was grounded. Not with the heat of anger, not with the theatrics of a parent disciplining a child, just a cold, controlled sentence dropped into my lap. He even added that I would spend the rest of the night in my old bedroom so I could cool off. I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. Still, I didn't protest. I simply nodded, picked up my briefcase, and walked down the hallway. My shoes sank into the carpet the way they had when I was 13 years old. When I reached the bedroom door, he pulled it shut behind me. I heard the click of the lock, a soft, final sound. For a moment, I just stood there, the dim light of the hallway gone, replaced by the muted glow of the single lamp on the dresser. The room looked exactly as I had left it years ago. The posters, the books, the quiet. It was like stepping into a museum exhibit of a girl I no longer remember being. Outside the window, snow began to fall. Light, scattered flakes catching the street lamp glow. The world kept moving, completely unaware that a fully grown woman with a federal briefcase had just been locked in her childhood bedroom for refusing to apologize on command. And I stood there, calm, steady, already planning my exit. It was almost mechanical, the way my mind shifted from feeling to logistics. I waited until the hallway went quiet, until footsteps faded and doors clicked shut. Then I opened the window, climbed onto the small overhang beneath it, and lowered myself to the ground with the same practiced ease I used during field exercises. No drama, no panic, just movement. The cold hit me first, sharp enough to wake every nerve. But the air tasted cleaner than anything inside that house. I walked to my car without looking back. The engine started on the first try, and I pulled away from the curb as if leaving a meeting that had simply run too long. I drove home on quiet roads, the kind that wind through Milwaukee neighborhoods with older trees and houses, lit for the holiday. When I arrived, I moved through my childhood bedroom with the efficiency of someone conducting an evidence sweep. I packed only what mattered: my laptop, a few documents, a pair of worn jeans, 2 shirts, an old scarf my grandmother knitted before she passed. The rest stayed. Every piece of clothing my mom had bought me, every framed photo my dad insisted belonged on the dresser, every trace of the daughter they preferred remained neatly in place. Before leaving, I placed my key on the nightstand and wrote 2 words on a slip of paper. No accusations, no explanation. Just 2 quiet words. Then I set it on the kitchen counter where they would find it. At some point, I must have paused in the doorway and looked back at the living room. The place where I had listened to my dad practice speeches, where my sister and I watched cartoons on Saturday mornings, where my mom arranged holiday decorations like she was staging a magazine spread. It all looked very orderly, very permanent, as if nothing inside it could ever break. But the truth is that families do not break suddenly. They erode, one assumption at a time. one blind loyalty at a time, until a moment comes that exposes how fragile it all really was. The federal building was nearly empty when I arrived, just after 4 in the afternoon. Morning. I let myself in with my badge, listened to the echo of my footsteps down the polished corridor, and felt the familiar weight of the work settle onto my shoulders. I belonged here. Not in that country club dining room where everyone treated me like a wayward child who needed correcting. I rode the elevator to the 12th floor. The lights flickered on automatically above me as I walked to my office. Everything felt still, suspended, quietly waiting. I placed my briefcase on the desk and opened it. Subpoenas, wire transfer maps, transaction anomalies tied directly to Whitlock Industrial Group logistics accounts, and the cooperation packet for my dad, the one he could have accepted if he had asked even one question before, humiliating me in front of that room. I emailed the Assistant United States Attorney at 4:12 in the morning. It was a short message, confirmation that I was done trying to intervene informally. Done trying to warn him. Done trying to save what he never valued in the first place. When I hit send, I sat back in my chair and watched the snow fall outside the 12th floor. Windows. The city lights blurred behind the storm. A new year was a few hours away, and whether my dad knew it or not, the countdown had already begun. I did not feel triumph, or anger, or even grief. I felt clarity, cold, absolute clarity, the kind that arrives only when denial finally burns off. That night at the country club, my dad believed grounding me would restore the order he thought he had lost. But what he actually did was remove the last thread holding everything together. He gave me permission to walk away. I did. That sentence was still echoing faintly in my head when I pulled into the driveway of my parents' house a little before 6 in the morning. Dawn had not arrived yet. The sky over Milwaukee was a flat, heavy gray, the kind that made the streetlights look tired. My hands felt strangely steady on the steering wheel, as if the clarity from the night before had settled into something even colder. The house looked exactly as it always did after a holiday gathering. Candles still flickering in the front windows, the wreath slightly crooked from being slammed shut too many times by arriving guests. My dad's car parked at the exact angle he preferred, no more than a palm's width from the garage door, and behind the living room curtains, a faint golden glow. They were awake. I sat in the driveway for a few seconds, letting the engine idle. I told myself I was not avoiding anything. I was simply observing, documenting the moment the way I documented everything else. The last time I would ever walk into that house as the daughter they believed they could manage. I opened the door quietly, boots crunching on the thin layer of frost that had formed overnight. When I stepped inside, the warmth of the house hit me, thick with the lingering scent of last night's baked ham and my mom's favorite, pine candle. For a moment, I stood perfectly still in the entryway, listening. Upstairs, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate. He had always woken early. Years of running Whitlock Industrial Group had built that habit into him. Even on holidays, he was usually up before the rest of us, reviewing numbers, planning deals, calling managers. The man could turn a celebration into a board meeting without breaking a sweat. I heard him reach the top of the stairs and pause at the landing. A moment later, his voice floated down, sharp enough to cut through the quiet. Finally learned your place. It was the same tone he had used the previous night. Firm, self-satisfied, convinced he had regained control. He had no idea I was standing only a few feet away, watching him from the base of the stairs. He moved down the hallway toward my old bedroom. The door was halfway open, and he pushed it aside the rest of the way with the back of his hand. The hinges squeaked softly. Then silence. Not a long silence, just long enough for confusion to set in. I already knew what he was seeing. The room I had wiped clean only a few hours earlier. Bed made tight, closet empty, desk drawers open, nothing inside. No suitcase, no clothing, no books or pictures. Not a single sign that the person who had slept there for more than a decade had ever returned home last night. He cleared his throat, a sound he made whenever something disrupted his expectation. The man could negotiate multi-million-dollar contracts without blinking, but an unmade plan unnerved him. Where is she? Her voice was soft, but threaded with worry she tried to hide. I don't know, he said, except the tone suggested he was not particularly concerned. She is probably trying to make a point. Make a point. That was his explanation for everything I did that did not fit neatly into whatever. My mom hurried past him into the room, her slippers whispering against the carpet. Maya. She sounded breathless. Maya. She is not here. Nothing is here. Then came the sound of hangers sliding across the empty bar in the closet, a small, hollow clatter. Oh my God, she whispered. Thomas, her things are gone. He grunted. She is being dramatic. She will come home after she cools off. Mom turned toward him, voice rising just a fraction. She did not take anything, not even her coat. At that exact moment, she must have spotted the nightstand, the place where I had left my key. I heard the sharp inhale before she spoke again. She left her key. Why would she leave her key? My dad finally stepped fully into the room, his footsteps heavier than hers. He was still half expecting this to be some ploy, a reaction he could swat away with a lecture. But the emptiness was undeniable. He bent down, picked up the key, studied the small silver shape as if it might reveal a more reasonable explanation. Footsteps sounded from the hallway, and then Elena appeared in the doorway, still in pajama pants and an oversized sweatshirt. Her hair was twisted into a messy knot, and her eyes were red, though I could not tell if it was from sleep or the wine she had drowned in the night before. What is going on? She asked, rubbing her forehead. Why are you in her room? Mom gestured helplessly. Everything is gone. Ryan appeared behind Elena. He had dressed quickly, already wearing a button-down shirt and slacks. He moved with a sort of cautious curiosity, pretending he had no idea what he was about to see. But I knew better. He knew exactly what this meant. He just had to act surprised long enough to avoid suspicion. He stood in the doorway and nodded slowly, as if assessing damage after a minor. Did she say anything before leaving? My dad's jaw tensed. He was still grasping for control, reaching for a comfortable narrative. She will come back. She always comes back. I knew that tone. It was less a prediction and more a demand disguised as confidence. Mom knelt near the closet, looking at the empty floor as though I might have left a clue there. She looked small and shaken. She always hated conflict, especially the kind that poked holes in our family's perfect public image. Where would she go? She whispered. It was not a question anyone intended to answer. A mother simply saying the words she feared most. My dad stepped back from the room, irritation replacing uncertainty. She is trying to make me feel guilty. This is about last night. That apology nonsense. She wants attention. Even in the silence that followed, he did not hear himself. He never did. He mistook absence for strategy, boundaries for manipulation, and independence for disrespect. He turned away from the room and walked down the hallway toward the staircase, dismissing the situation entirely. Behind him, I heard Elena say quietly, almost to herself, "That is not what this looks like." There was doubt in her voice. Something had cracked inside her, too. Maybe she finally realized that grounding a grown woman in a room full of people was not the harmless joke she pretended it was. I did not wait to hear more. Standing there in the entryway, coat still on, I felt a strange sensation move through me. Not grief, not anger, something like confirmation, proof that walking away had not been impulsive or emotional. It had been necessary. I opened the door quietly and stepped outside again. Cold air rushed over my face, waking up whatever numbness had settled there. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east, just a faint blue behind the bare branches of the neighborhood trees. When I reached my car, I paused with my hand on the door handle. Through the window, I could still hear muffled voices inside the house, layered with confusion, blame, denial. All of them talking around the truth without touching it. I slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. The silence inside the car felt vast. I started the engine and backed out slowly, careful not to wake the neighbors. The tires whispered over the frost-coated pavement as I turned onto the main road, heading toward the freeway entrance. Milwaukee faded behind me in the rearview mirror, the familiar streets and porches blurring as the city stirred awake. I kept both hands on the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the highway stretching ahead. There was no dramatic music, no surge of triumph, just the steady hum of the engine and the knowledge that one chapter had closed quietly behind me. By the time I crossed the state line into Illinois, the sky had opened fully. Pale morning light washed over the fields and distant buildings, and the snow from the night before clung to the shoulders of the road like a thin white border. Traffic was light. Most people were still asleep or eating leftover holiday pastries or nursing hangovers from midnight champagne. I drove past the first toll plaza, the familiar pattern of signs guiding me toward Chicago. The Federal Building downtown was still an hour away, but the direction felt right. Solid. Grounded in a way that had nothing to do with punishment. Somewhere near the outskirts of the city, I reached into the inside pocket of my coat and felt the slip of paper I had left on the kitchen counter earlier that morning. I had written 2 words, and neither of them had been angry. I had not told them where I was going or why. I had not tried to defend myself. I had not begged to be understood. I simply acknowledged the truth none of them had been willing to see. I folded my hands back around the steering wheel, letting the memory of that moment settle into place. There would be consequences for what happened at that dinner table, real and irreversible consequences. But they were no longer mine to carry. The freeway curved toward the skyline, the tall buildings rising in the distance like a quiet reminder of the life I had chosen. The work I was committed to, the boundaries I had finally set. I kept driving. The skyline sharpened as I got closer, glass and steel slicing through the pale morning light. Chicago always looked different in the early hours, quieter, stripped of the constant motion that defined it. I exited onto Lower Wacker, the roads nearly empty, and pulled into the underground parking beneath the Federal Building. The air down there was cold and metallic, the kind that clung to your coat long after you left. I killed the engine and sat there for a few seconds, hands resting on the steering wheel. The silence was heavy, not oppressive, just full of everything I had not said the night before. Then I reached for my briefcase, checked the latch, and stepped out of the car. Inside the lobby, the security lights cast a pale glow across the marble floor. Only one guard was on duty at that hour, a man named Collins who had worked that shift for as long as I had been, assigned to the Chicago field office. He looked up, startled, as I approached. "You are early," he said, scanning my ID. Could not sleep. It was true in the way that federal statements often are. Not the whole story, but close enough. He handed back my badge. "Everything is all right." I nodded. Then I walked toward the elevator before he could ask anything else. The ride to the 12th floor felt longer than usual. The elevator hummed and vibrated faintly as it climbed. When the doors opened, the hallway was dark. Motion sensors slowed to wake up, creating small pockets of light as I walked past each doorway. I passed the framed bulletin boards, the outdated posters about interdepartmental collaboration, the row of locked filing cabinets that held the kind of secrets no one ever wanted to read. My office was near the end of the hall. I unlocked the door, slipped inside, and shut it behind me. The familiar click of the deadbolt settling into place gave me a strange sense of stability, like the sound of a boundary being restored. I set my coat over the back of the chair, placed the briefcase on the desk, and pulled out my badge and federal access token. My monitor flickered awake as soon as I tapped the keyboard. The login screen glowed blue in the half-lit room. I typed my credentials, waited for the system to authenticate, and watched my case dashboard populate with its usual flood of data. Transaction logs, suspicious activity flags, internal memos, analyst notes, redacted communications, all of it waiting for review. I slid into my chair, the leather cool from the overnight temperature dip, and opened the file directory for the Whitlock Industrial Group investigation. The internal case code blinked in the corner of the screen, a cluster of letters and numbers that had been part of my everyday life for nearly 2 years. It was strange knowing that I had spent more time analyzing my dad's company than I had spent talking to him over that same period. Stranger still, that he had no idea. I reached for the case keycard in my pocket and inserted it into the encrypted drive. The files unlocked with a soft chime. I pulled up the most recent audit logs, scanning the flagged transactions. These were familiar numbers, familiar accounts, familiar inconsistencies. My phone buzzed once. A system notification. "Compliance review pending," it read. That was standard for mornings when a major update had been submitted, overnight. But this one had my name on it. A verification request for potential conflict of interest. I stared at the message for a few seconds. There it was. The shadow that had followed me since the day I realized the investigation was going to intersect directly with my family. This was why I had been so careful. Why I had never said a word to any of them. Why I had kept every thought, every suspicion, every painful discovery locked behind protocols. I acknowledged the notification and set the phone aside. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps in the hallway. slow, measured. My supervisor had a very distinct cadence when he walked, a steady rhythm that signaled he had already read whatever email he was about to confront you about. Agent Holt appeared in my doorway and leaned against the frame. The overhead sensor had finally turned on the hallway lights, washing him in a pale fluorescent glow. "You are beating the sun today," he said. His voice was calm, but I could hear the question underneath it. "Long night," I answered. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him but leaving the blinds open. That was his way of signaling this was a procedural conversation, not a disciplinary one. "I saw your update," he said. "You know the drill. If any part of this case becomes personal, you have to report it." "It is not personal," I said. And technically, that was true. Personal would have implied emotion. What I had was information. He studied my face for a few seconds, searching for something. "This is a sensitive file," he said finally. "We need to follow protocol." I nodded. I always followed protocol. It was the only reason I had been allowed to stay in this case in the first place. There had been a round of arguments about that early on. Legal advisors worrying about bias. Upper management worrying about optics. No one wants an analyst with a personal tie to the target company. But I had been the one who spotted the discrepancies first. The pattern inside the numbers. The transactions that did not align with typical logistic flows. The timing that matched external indicators of financial laundering. My analysis had triggered the deeper review, which led to the formal investigation. By the time it became clear that the company involved was my dad's, the case was already too far along. Holt exhaled sharply and straightened. "Just keep everything documented." He left the door open when he stepped out, another signal. If he had been genuinely concerned, he would have closed it. I returned to the screen, pulling up the earliest flagged transactions. Dates from more than a year earlier. At the time, I had chalked them up to clerical anomalies. Human error in large-scale logistics is common, after all, but the inconsistencies continued to surface. Amounts that were too round. Routing numbers that did not match distribution patterns. Cargo manifests that listed shipments that did not physically exist. I clicked into one of the older files and my breath caught slightly. It was a scanned document from a previous investigation, one I had studied in training. My uncle's case from 2011, the one that rewired something inside me, the one that had taught me that numbers do not lie, no matter how much people do. He had been caught manipulating corporate accounts for a mid-sized manufacturing firm. Small adjustments at first, tiny shifts that went unnoticed. Then larger ones. Then external shell contracts. When the pattern finally emerged, it was too late. He went to prison. My family never really talked about it, except in hushed tones that framed him as weak, reckless, embarrassing. I remembered sitting in my dorm room years later, reading through the public case file. The precision of the investigators, the clarity with which they reconstructed his choices, the relentless honesty of the data. I understood then that truth often looked like betrayal, and betrayal often looked like accountability. That was when I knew what kind of work I wanted to do. Not glamorous, not heroic, necessary. I closed the old file and reopened the cooperation packet I had drafted for my dad. The offer that would have protected him if he had agreed to testify against the individuals using his company as a laundering channel. It was a solid proposal, a narrow window of safety, but real. All he had needed to do was ask. One question, one moment of willingness to hear something he did not want to hear. Instead, he had grounded me in front of a room full of people. I pulled the packet out of my briefcase, laying the pages flat on the desk. Federal header. Detailed list of required disclosures. Immunity contingencies. Terms of cooperation. And the signature line that remained empty. The irony was not lost on me. I had tried to save him, tried to keep the fallout from swallowing him whole, not out of obligation or guilt, but because I believed he deserved the truth before anyone else in that room did. And because I believed he might want to do the right thing. But all he saw was disobedience. I sat back in my chair, rubbing the bridge of my nose as the fluorescent lights flickered on overhead. My office was warming now, the vent near the floor humming a low, steady rhythm. Outside the window, the sky had turned a pale gray, streaked with hints of rose from the rising sun. I turned to my computer again and opened a new message, addressed to the Assistant United States Attorney. The cursor blinked, waiting. I typed a single sentence. It was clean, direct. No emotional embellishment. Proceed as planned. I read it twice. I did not add anything. Not context, not justification, not explanation. I hit send and watched the message disappear from my outbox, a small digital signal moving through quiet federal servers, carrying more weight than anyone in my family would ever imagine. For a moment I sat there, letting the stillness settle around me. Then I closed my laptop and leaned back in the chair. That was when another thought arrived, unwelcome but clear. If the investigation was a structure of numbers and timelines, then Ryan Kessler had been the scaffolding that held the entire thing together. Not officially, not visibly, but in all the ways that mattered. I had known men like him before. Men who walked into rooms with a sense of ownership before they even met them. People inside. Men who believed they were the smartest voice at the table. Men who treated charm like currency. They were always tidy on paper and dangerous in practice. Ryan had joined our family with surprising speed. Elena introduced him one spring afternoon at a restaurant on the Milwaukee riverfront. She looked giddy in a way that made me uneasy. They had been dating for only a few months, and he was already talking about future plans, vacations, joint investments, real estate ventures. My dad took to him instantly. He liked men who moved decisively. Men who made money. Men who spoke in confident generalities that implied mastery without ever offering specifics. I remember sitting across from him that afternoon, watching the way he folded his napkin with precise, almost surgical movements. His voice was warm, his posture relaxed, but he never asked a single question about me. Not where I worked, not what I did, not what interested me. He asked about my dad's business instead. He asked about logistics contracts and revenue growth, and whether my dad had ever considered expanding his consulting network. Elena did not seem to notice the imbalance. My dad certainly did not. Attention from someone like Ryan was a compliment in his world. A few weeks later, Ryan was at every family dinner. A few months after that, he proposed. Elena said yes before she finished the glass of champagne she was holding. My mom cried. The sentimental kind of tears she reserved for weddings, graduations, and yearly holiday cards. My dad clapped Ryan on the back and said he had always wanted a son who understood business. I kept my thoughts to myself. At that point, I had no reason to assume anything sinister. He was just another ambitious man with a talent for positioning himself near people of influence, a common species. It was only after I began reviewing certain flagged transactions that the shape of him changed. At first, the anomalies tied to Whitlock Industrial Group looked small, simple rounding errors or misclassified expenses. But when I charted them across time and then layered the patterns against external vendor reports, the picture sharpened. Funds routed into consulting channels that did not match the company's operational footprint. Payments to third-party logistics providers that existed only on paper. Disbursements signed off by an internal consultant whose name appeared nowhere in the company's payroll systems. That name was tied to Ryan's holding company. I did not report that discovery immediately. I wanted to be sure, so I ran a second analysis. Then a third. Each one revealed the same pattern, the same inconsistencies, the same signature of a laundering channel, cleverly woven through a legitimate business structure. I sat with that information for several nights, staring at the data until the numbers blurred. I kept asking myself the same question. Did my dad know? And every time I ran the numbers again, the answer remained unchanged. The financial maneuvers were too subtle for someone like my dad to have designed. He was many things, but subtle was not one of them. Ryan, on the other hand, had a gift for it. A few weeks before the New Year's Eve dinner, I found an internal memo buried inside a forwarded email chain. It was from the company's attorney, Daniel Cross, gently raising concerns about a set of unusual invoices. His language was diplomatic but precise. He recommended reviewing the transactions for compliance. My dad had responded with a short dismissal. Then Ryan sent a follow-up, recommending the issue be tabled until the next quarter. That was when I realized he had positioned himself as my dad's unofficial advisor. Not officially employed, not formally recognized, but I was consulted, trusted, listened to. Once that door was open, he used it constantly. I saw the pattern in digital form. My mom saw it in smaller, human ways. She once told me he always made a point of complimenting her meal before offering a suggestion. Always flattered her before steering a conversation. Always offered to help my dad before subtly correcting him. At the time, she took those things as signs of respect. She did not understand that people like Ryan learned early how to contour their kindness around someone else's blind spots. The night of the New Year's Eve dinner, he had been watching me closely, not because he cared what I thought, but because he had finally realized I was not simply an irritating daughter with too many questions, or a sister who analyzed everything as if it were an accounting error. He recognized something else. He recognized the threat. That recognition shifted the ground beneath both of us. I thought about this while I organized my files that morning. I pulled up the email threads, the scanned invoices, the vendor statements that never aligned with shipment records. Each document was a piece of Ryan's architecture. Clean, polished, designed to dissolve under casual scrutiny, but reveal everything under forensic analysis. At one point, I leaned back in my chair and let my mind drift to a moment from the night before. Ryan standing at the bar, watching me like a man checking the structural integrity of a beam he had hoped would stay unnoticed. He had miscalculated. I had been dismantling that structure for months, and he never saw it. I could almost hear him now. That smooth voice, that steady confidence, the careful way he managed my dad, without my dad realizing he was being managed. I turned back to my screen and clicked into a flagged memo from the company attorney. It was short and cautious. He had highlighted the unusual routing numbers and questioned whether the related consultant had been properly vetted. It was clear he did not suspect my dad of wrongdoing. He suspected negligence. That was reasonable. People like my dad trusted too easily when the trust fed their ego. I remembered a conversation I overheard a year earlier during a family gathering. My dad had pulled Ryan aside near the patio doors while guests mingled. He spoke openly, the way he did when he felt admired. He told Ryan he wished he had met him sooner, that the company needed someone with his insight. Ryan had smiled. Not a full smile. A quiet, pleased one. The kind predators wear when their prey steps closer on its own. I closed the memo and pushed my chair back, standing and stretching the stiffness from my shoulders. The morning was wearing on. More staff would arrive soon. The hallway outside was already more alive with footsteps and low conversations. I stepped out of my office briefly to refill my water bottle. As I passed the open conference room, I heard my coworkers discussing their holiday plans, voices warm and light. No one here had any idea that by the end of the week, a federal raid would be underway on a company owned by one of the most well-known business families in Wisconsin. I returned to my office and stood for a moment by the window. From the 12th floor, Chicago looked like a grid of intent. Every building is upright and exact. Every street is a deliberate intersection. It reminded me of the case files. Everything connected once you drew the lines correctly. A soft chime sounded from my computer, and I turned back to my desk. A new message. Internal compliance alert. One more verification required. I clicked through and completed it, attaching documentation for conflict review. The same familiar process. Then something else caught my eye. A forwarded message inside a separate folder. One I must have missed earlier. It was from my mom, sent to my dad. Her tone was anxious. She had written late the previous night after I had left the house. She worried that something was wrong with me, that I seemed closed off, that I had pulled away from the family. And then came the part that made my stomach tighten. Ryan had responded before my dad could. He reassured her that grounding me had been the right decision, that I had been under pressure, that creating distance would help stabilize the family dynamic. It was a gentle manipulation, phrased as care, structured as a concern, designed to isolate. I sat down slowly. The full picture was clear now. He had been guiding them toward that moment for weeks, maybe months. A subtle tightening of influence, a slow shaping of perception, preparing them to interpret my withdrawal not as a warning, but as instability, preparing them to question my credibility if I ever spoke up. He thought the problem was emotional. He thought I would react instead of respond. He underestimated the amount of evidence sitting on my desk. I opened a locked drawer and took out a small government-issued phone I rarely used. I keyed in the passcode. There were several saved draft messages, all unsent. Notes I had written when I began to suspect how deep the laundering might run. Patterns I wanted to cross-check. Observations I had made about the timing of certain approvals. And one line near the bottom that looked almost like a sentence from someone else. He is not careless. He is calculated. I stared at those words for a moment. Then I placed the phone back into the drawer and locked it. Across my desk, my personal phone buzzed. A text alert. An unknown number. The message was simple. A single line. Problem neutralized. The sender was masked. The timing was unmistakable. I did not need a name to know who had sent it. Ryan believes that pushing me out of the family narrative would push me out of the investigation, too. A misunderstanding that would cost him far more than he could imagine. I set the phone face down on the desk, took a slow breath, and glanced again at the skyline outside my window. The day was just beginning. I watched the skyline for another few seconds, letting the weight of the morning settle somewhere low and solid inside me. And then my phone vibrated again. This time it was not an unknown number. It was my dad. The same notification tone I had heard since I was a teenager. I stared at the screen without touching it. The call ended. Then it started again. And again. He must have been calling in a loop, the way he always did when he believed persistence could bend reality. I let the phone go quiet. He needed my apology. At least, that was the story he had chosen to believe. In his mind, the situation was simple. I had been disrespectful, therefore I owed him contrition. The formula was almost comforting in its familiarity. My dad liked problems with one correct answer. He liked situations where the path to resolution was obedience. If he could frame something as defiance, he could restore order by waiting for submission. Around 8:30, my phone rang again, but this time it was Elena. I hesitated and then answered, mostly because I knew she would keep calling until she wore herself out. She did not bother with a greeting. Her voice came fast and sharp. She demanded to know what I was doing. She said Mom was upset. She said my dad had barely slept. She said Ryan thought I might be overwhelmed or unstable. She layered concern with accusation, the way she had since we were girls. She did not ask if I was safe. She did not ask where I was. She demanded an apology on behalf of the family. I listened without interrupting. Something in me had grown still since the night before. When she finally paused to breathe, I told her that I would not apologize. The line went silent. I could almost picture her face, caught between disbelief and anger. She asked if this was about pride, or ego, or resentment from old childhood arguments. I said no. It was about legality, about federal timelines, about an opportunity that would not come again. She did not understand. She could not understand. She only knew the version of me that had been quiet enough to disappear inside the family noise. She told me my dad loved me and that he had been patient. She asked why I was choosing this moment, of all moments, to blow up our lives. I told her I was not blowing up anything. I had tried to protect my dad months ago, long before she even noticed something was wrong. I told her I had a responsibility beyond family loyalty. I told her the apology she wanted was never an apology in the first place. She asked what I meant. I considered explaining it carefully, step by step, the way I would in a deposition. Then I realized it would not matter. She had already chosen a side. I said goodbye and hung up before she could answer. For a moment, I let the empty office surround me. The building was waking up around me. Doors opening, lights clicking on, the murmur of staff greeting each other in the hallway. My world was split cleanly in two now. The life they believed I lived, and the reality I was walking through. I returned to my desk and opened my laptop again. The cooperation packet was still visible on the screen, the edges of each scanned page sharp and unforgiving. It stunned me sometimes, how something so thin and weightless could hold the power to redirect the future of an entire family. The offer had been written plainly. If my dad cooperated fully and immediately, he would receive consideration at sentencing. There were no promises, but there was the potential for leniency, enough that he could keep his freedom, enough that he could keep the house, the business, whatever remained, untouched. He had no idea that the apology he demanded was the same act that might save him. I leaned back, closing my eyes for just a moment. I had practiced this conversation in my head countless times over the last several weeks. Not an emotional confession, not a dramatic confrontation, just a simple explanation delivered in the calmest voice I could manage. Dad, this is not an accusation. It is a warning. The people you trust are pulling you into something criminal. I can help you if you let me. I could see him sitting across from me, his shoulders lifted, his jaw set. He would ask for specifics. He would demand proof. He would say I was exaggerating. He would say Ryan was a good man, that Elena was happy, that I was creating problems because I struggled to accept change. He would talk until he convinced himself I was wrong. I opened my eyes. There was no point rehearsing the conversation anymore. It would never happen. He had chosen his narrative. He had chosen his advisor. He had chosen to believe that obedience from me was the solution. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The only thing standing between him and a federal indictment was the same daughter he had tried to discipline like a child. I reached for my phone and scrolled through missed calls. My dad again. Then Mom. Then my dad once more. Their messages came in waves. Worry. Frustration. Then worry again. None of them asked the question that mattered. Why did I leave with my briefcase? Why did the apology matter so much? Why now? I set the phone aside and turned back to my desk. A soft rap sounded at my door, and I looked up to see Special Agent Denise Porter standing there. She stepped inside and closed the door gently behind her. She had been on the ethics panel that evaluated my conflict disclosures. Her presence meant the conversation was official. She asked if I had finalized the evidence transfer. I told her yes. She asked if I understood the implications of submitting something this personal. I told her it had stopped being personal a long time ago. She nodded slowly. She had seen this before. Agents caught between professional responsibility and family entanglement. It rarely ended cleanly. She reminded me of the rules. I could not contact my dad directly about the investigation anymore. I could not warn him. I could not intervene. She said it gently, but I already knew the words by heart. I had signed the protocol myself. She asked if I needed a few minutes alone before the next step. I shook my head. The decision had been made days ago, even if no one in my family realized it. Denise left quietly, and I resumed assembling the final digital folder. Transaction logs. Vendor communications. Recorded inconsistencies in shipment timestamps. Internal memos raising concern. My own audit trail. Every document was a brick. Every brick was part of the same structure. A structure Ryan had built with my dad standing just close enough to be implicated. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. This time, a voicemail from Mom. Her voice sounded thin and shaking. She said Dad had been pacing the hallway since dawn. She said he kept glancing at my bedroom door as if I might walk out at any moment. She said he believed I was just angry, that I needed time. That evening, I would come home and apologize, restore the balance, bring the family back together. I pressed the phone to my forehead for a second and let the sound of her voice fade. An apology. It was almost tragic how easily that word had been weaponized. In our house, it had always meant the same thing. Accommodation. Containment. Restoration of hierarchy. I had spent years smoothing conflicts that were never mine to carry. I had watched my dad bend over backward for Elena, but expected quiet, compliance from me. I had learned how to make myself smaller simply to keep the peace. The apology they wanted was not an apology. It was consent. I opened my eyes and went back to work. By mid-afternoon, everything was complete. The evidence was logged, files encrypted, chain of custody established. There was one step left. The final confirmation to the Assistant United States Attorney on the case. I typed slowly, keeping my tone clinical. Documentation review complete. All materials verified. Subject has declined all previous opportunities for voluntary cooperation. Recommend proceeding with next action pursuant to statute. I read the message once, then again. My finger hovered for a full second before pressing send. The message disappeared into the system. A few minutes later, a reply appeared. Single line. Understood. Warrant approval in process. My office felt strangely quiet, like it was absorbing the shift before I fully registered it myself. This was the point of no return. The moment when the investigation stopped being preventative and became inevitable. I stood and walked to the window again. The sky had shifted into late afternoon light, soft and muted. Traffic moved steadily below. People going to and from appointments, couples out for a walk, strangers living normal lives in a city that had no idea what was unfolding above them. My phone vibrated one more time. A notification from the encrypted federal system. Warrant signed. Execution window set. I exhaled slowly. Not relief, not victory, something quieter. A kind of stillness. The raid was coming, and once that thought settled, it refused to move. It sat in the room with me, steady and quiet. Like a clock I could hear even when it wasn't ticking. The execution window was exactly 48 hours. Not approximately, not around. Exactly. Federal timelines have no sentiment in them. They advance the way tides advance, indifferent to whoever is standing too close when the water rises. By early evening, I had packed up my things and left the office. I drove without turning on the radio. My mind did not wander. It stayed on a narrow track made of numbers, timestamps, and the simple reality that everything was now out of my hands. That should have comforted me, but it only made the silence feel heavier. The next morning began with my phone vibrating on the nightstand for several minutes before I reached for it. Missed calls from Mom, a text from Elena saying my dad wanted to see me, something about finalizing paperwork before the holiday. She wrote as if we were discussing dinner plans, as if the previous 48 hours had not shifted the ground beneath all of us. I put the phone face down and sat on the edge of the bed. The apartment was quiet. I had chosen it for that reason. Away from everything. A place where I could think clearly. Today would be the last day of calm before the break in the line. I felt the weight of that. The heaviness had a shape now. Around 9 in the morning, I checked my secure messages. A reminder from Internal Affairs about my conflict review. A note from Special Agent Porter asking for documentation of any family contact. A short message from the Assistant United States Attorney confirming the scheduled briefing at the end of the day. It was all routine in content, but not in tone. When an investigation reaches a certain point, everyone begins moving more precisely. No wasted steps. I made coffee, not because I needed it, but because I needed the motion. Something repetitive. Something small. At the same time across town, my dad was sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a folder Ryan had given him. I knew this only because Mom left a voicemail that drifted between worry and irritation. She said he had barely touched his breakfast. She said he kept insisting I would apologize before the weekend. She said Ryan had arranged an opportunity for the company, and my dad needed to sign before the market reopened on Monday. I replayed her voice in my mind. The way she tried to sound calm but kept losing her footing. She had always been the one who held our family together with soft reassurances. She was doing it again now, even as the walls began to tilt. By noon, the day began to fracture into smaller scenes. A call from compliance requesting clarification about an overlapping timestamp. A brief meeting with a colleague who had no idea anything unusual was happening and asked if I wanted to join a lunch run. A notification from the case management system confirming data replication for the warrant logs. Each moment ordinary on its own, but collectively forming a pattern that made my chest tighten. Then came the message that shifted the pressure upward another degree. A request for an immediate meeting from Deputy Director Warren, not a suggestion. A requirement. I walked down the hallway, passing framed photographs of award ceremonies and retired agents. The corridor smelled faintly of industrial cleaning solution, something sharp and sterile. When I entered Warren's office, he gestured for me to sit. He asked if I understood the seriousness of continuing work on a case involving my own family. I said yes. He asked if I had disclosed every potential conflict. I said yes. He asked if I had contacted them since submitting the packet. I said no. All of those answers were true. His eyes softened only slightly. He said that several members of the Oversight Committee believed my involvement should be paused until the execution of the warrant. He said they were concerned about the emotional strain. He did not say they were concerned I might intervene, but the implication was visible in the air between us. For a second, I felt the ground give a little beneath me. Not from guilt, from the familiar fear of being removed from a situation I had built piece by piece. He said no decision had been made, but I should prepare for temporary reassignment if there was any sign of breach. He reminded me again that I could not reach out to my family. I nodded, calm. Too calm, maybe. The version of calm you learn only after enough doors have slammed in your front life. When I left his office, my legs felt steady, but my stomach tightened into something small. I reached my own office and closed the door behind me. I did not sit. I stood in the middle of the room and took one long breath. Then another. Internal affairs, leadership oversight, conflict review, all of them closing in. There was one choice left. I could stay the course, or I could fracture it by trying one more time to save my dad. I sat down and opened my laptop. My cursor hovered over my dad's contact for a second. Just a second, long enough to feel the temptation rise. Then I closed the window and turned back to the case files. My decision was simple. I would not interfere. Not anymore. Somewhere across the city, the opposite was happening. Around 3 p.m, my dad met with attorney Daniel Cross. I was not in the room, but I heard enough from the later reports to imagine the tone. Daniel was concerned. Not emotional, not dramatic. He simply pointed out that a vendor reconciliation report included activity that did not match any authorized shipments. He asked my dad if he had reviewed a set of wire transfers. My dad told him Ryan was handling the growth strategy and everything was under good control. I could hear my dad's voice even though I was not there. Confidence. Slightly defensive. Quick to reassure. Slow to listen. Daniel encouraged him to slow down on signing anything new until the discrepancies were reviewed. Then he asked a question he must have been holding for days. Had my dad considered contacting an auditor? A neutral party? My dad apparently grew irritated. He ended the conversation abruptly and called Ryan on his way back to the office. Ryan must have responded immediately. He always did when control was threatened. He told my dad not to worry. He said Daniel was overly cautious. He reminded my dad that opportunities do not wait for people who hesitate. He told him the new deal needed to be finalized before the holiday for optimal positioning. My dad wanted to believe him. Faith is a simple thing when someone feeds it a steady diet of certainty. Around 5:30, I received another voicemail from Mom. She said the house felt strange without me. She said Dad had asked her 3 times if I had called. She said Elena was quiet and pacing. She said Ryan had taken a phone call in the hallway and sounded irritated. She said she did not know what was happening, but she felt something was very, very wrong. Her voice broke slightly at the end. That part shook something loose inside me, but not enough to undo anything, not enough to interfere. I returned to the warrant timeline and reviewed the operational notes. Nothing out of place. Nothing delayed. The raid was moving forward as scheduled. The next several hours passed in pieces. A late evening call from the Assistant United States Attorney to confirm the evidence trail. A quiet conversation with Special Agent Porter in the hallway about next day. Logistics. A brief moment at my desk when I stared at the framed photo of me and Elena as kids. I had kept that picture for years, even after everything changed, as if the memory inside it acted as a hinge connecting different versions of us. I did not move it. I simply looked at it and then turned back to my work. The city outside grew darker. The office thinned. Most people left for the holiday weekend. I remained. I was not avoiding home. I simply had nowhere I needed to be except here. Around 9 p.m, a secure message appeared on my screen. Deployment countdown initiated. 48 hours, window closing. All units confirm readiness. I sat back and let those words settle. A simple confirmation. A wide door swinging shut. Across town, my dad sat at his desk, reviewing the final pages of the agreement Ryan wanted him to sign. He had not eaten dinner. Mom had set a plate beside him and he had not touched it. Elena sat on the sofa staring at her phone, as if waiting for a message that was not coming. Ryan moved around the house with practiced ease, steady and confident, as if the entire place belonged to him already. The clock kept moving. I checked the time on my computer. Just after 10. 48 hours almost fully elapsed. There was no sound in the room except the hum of the ventilation system. I closed my laptop and rested my hand on the cover for a moment, not as a gesture of finality, just acknowledgement. The window had closed, the line had been crossed, and whatever happened next was no longer mine to alter. I stood and walked to the window again. Lights flickered across the Chicago skyline, small and distant. Cars moved along the streets in thin lines of red and white. Hundreds of people below living ordinary evenings, unaware that one family's timeline had just tipped into something irreversible. I let the view settle into focus. Then the office lights dimmed slightly on their automatic schedule. 48 hours were over. The office lights dimmed slightly on their automatic schedule, and for a long moment I just stood there, watching the city breathe below me, aware that somewhere across Chicago, a clock had hit 0. That was the thing about federal timelines. They arrived without fanfare, without countdown music. Just a shift in the air. A new weight settling in. I left the office close to midnight, drove home, and slept for maybe 3 hours. Not well. Not deeply. More like drifting in and out of a current I could not control. When the vibration of my secure phone started against the nightstand, I was already awake. The message was short. Units deployed. Execution underway. I sat up, pressed my palms against my eyes, then stood and splashed water on my face. My reflection looked steadier than I felt. That always surprised me. How the outside could stay calm while everything underneath tightened. The second message arrived as I was locking my apartment door. Subjects present at primary location. Secondary and tertiary sites engaged. It was happening. I drove to the field office in silence. The early morning still dark and cold around me. Traffic lights blinked on empty streets. Some had that blinking yellow pattern that always made me feel like this city was half asleep and half listening. When I reached the office, the hallway was busier than I expected. Not chaotic, just full. Agents moving with controlled urgency. Radios crackled. Doors opened and closed. A few nodded at me, not out of friendliness, but recognition. Everyone knew which case was running today. I entered the operations room, and the large screens along the wall were already lit. Multiple feeds, warehouse entrances, the front office of the company, the loading bay, parking lots, street angles. Then I saw my dad. He was just arriving at the company's main building, carrying his usual leather binder, walking the way he always walked when he thought he had a productive day ahead. I felt something tighten in my chest. No regret. Not fear. Something more complicated. A painful clarity, maybe. Behind him, Elena stepped out of her car, pulling her coat tight. Ryan hung back slightly, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in that confident rhythm he used when he wanted people to think he was, handling something important. A voice behind me said that all units were in position. The next few minutes unspooled with a kind of brutal efficiency. Not violent, not dramatic, just absolute. A command echoed across the channel. Go. On the feed showing the loading dock, a line of agents moved in. They wore their tactical gear, but no masks. Federal raids are not performances. They are procedures. On the feed showing the front office, 2 agents approached the glass doors, badges raised. A receptionist froze. Another employee dropped his coffee. Papers scattered. Then the screen with my dad flashed bright as the sunlight hit the camera. Agents approached him calmly. One spoke. The audio was muted, but I could read the cadence from his posture. Identification. Mandate. Instructions. They asked him to step aside. My dad's face changed in a single second. Confusion first, then disbelief, then something like fear disguised as irritation. He shook his head, lifted his hand slightly, gesturing toward the building as if the agents were interrupting something routine. He tried to explain. He pointed at his office door. One of the agents held up a packet. The warrant. He looked at it, but did not take it. His shoulders lifted the way they always did when he felt cornered. I had seen that same posture during dozens of family arguments growing up. It felt surreal watching it play out on a federal screen. At the logistics warehouse, the scene unfolded differently. More movement, more noise. Forklifts abandoned. Employees stepping back with their hands raised. Agents inspecting pallets, cracking open crates, documenting labels. I watched it all, like someone watching their own memories being dismantled. Then the camera shifted to Ryan. He was standing near the row of delivery trucks, still on his phone. When the agents approached him, something flickered across his face. Not surprising. Calculation. He spoke quickly into the phone, ending whatever call he had been on, and turned as if he might walk casually toward the parking lot. He did not get far. An agent intercepted him. Another stepped behind him. They spoke. Ryan tried to talk over them. He gestured toward my dad as if the proximity to him might grant him authority. He reached for his pocket. Not fast, but fast enough to matter. The agents reacted instantly. They secured him. The phone fell to the pavement. He did not shout. That surprised me. He looked furious, but not panicked, like a man whose plan had been interrupted rather than destroyed. In the operations room, someone noted that he was attempting partial non-compliance. Someone else said to proceed with restraint protocols. The word sounded clinical, detached. Not cruel, just factual. On the office feed, Elena was frozen near the reception desk, her fingers pressed to her mouth. She looked around frantically, searching for someone to tell her what was happening. When two agents approached her to separate her from the scene, she let them guide her without resistance. She kept looking at my dad. He kept looking at the agents. My dad's confusion shifted into something harsher. He was talking quickly now, his hands moving more sharply. He pointed at the warrant packet again. He reached for his phone. An agent shook his head. My dad's shock began to crumble into anger. I recognized the expression too well. Agents began escorting employees into separate rooms. Questioning, documentation, standard procedure. My dad was led into a conference room, not handcuffed. He was not being arrested. He was being detained for questioning. Temporary. Procedural, but humiliating enough that he looked as if the floor had cracked beneath him. Ryan, on the other hand, was being walked toward a federal vehicle. His jaw was locked tight, his eyes narrow. Even through the grain of the video feed, I could see the expression of a man realizing his shield was gone. The access he had built through charm, lies, and pressure. Gone. The room around me shifted slightly as several agents entered with paperwork. One announced that significant irregularities had already been found in the shipping logs. Another said communications recovered from the warehouse office indicated premeditated fraud. Someone else confirmed that Ryan had attempted to dispose of a device seconds before apprehension. I kept watching the screen. My dad sat at a conference table, rubbing his forehead. His binder sat untouched beside him. A cup of coffee someone had placed nearby was cooling, untouched. An agent spoke to him, calm and measured. My dad shook his head again and again. It looked like denial, but it was scary. Plain, unfiltered fear. Elena was seated in another room, holding her phone with both hands as if it were the only solid thing left in her life. Tears streaked her face, but she was not sobbing. Just silent, devastated, lost. Then something shifted on her face. Not disbelief anymore. Recognition. A terrible realization that the man she married had been using her as a doorway. A soft entry point into the business. Into the family. Into my dad's trust. The camera feed adjusted and I saw my dad lean back in his chair, eyes closing for a moment. When he opened them, the agent was placing a set of documents in front of him. He looked at them with a kind of stunned detachment. His lips moved slightly, not forming words, just trying to make sense of a language he had never expected to encounter. Across the operations room, voices overlapped. Updates, seizures, confirmed matches between intercepted shipments and the flagged accounts. Everything was falling into place with the grim precision of dominoes tipping. One of the supervisors leaned toward the microphone to relay instructions. Authorize transport of primary suspect. Secure all digital records. Continue interview with non-custodial subjects. Non-custodial subject, my dad. Another screen switched to the holding area, where Ryan sat on a bench, wrists secured. His posture was still defiant. He leaned forward slightly, speaking sharply to the two agents across from him. They did not react. He tried again. His mouth formed questions, demands. Then I saw it. The flicker of panic he had tried so hard to hide. He turned his head sharply toward the door, as if expecting someone to come defend him. No one did. Back in the conference room, my dad looked up at the agent questioning him. He asked something I could not hear. The agent answered with professional calm. My dad pressed his palm to the table. His face tightened, and his gaze dropped to the documents again. He still had no idea that I was the origin point, not the enemy. not the accuser. The last safety line he never saw. I watched him breathe in deeply, his shoulders shaking slightly. Then he looked toward the door as if seeking someone who could explain, someone who could interpret this sudden new world. Someone he trusted. Someone who was not coming. An agent stepped into the operations room and said that counsel had been notified. Detained individuals would need legal representation immediately. Interviews would pause until attorneys arrived. My dad was about to learn what every person in his situation eventually learns. Once federal paperwork enters the room, life divides into before and after. On the feed, the agent in the conference room stood and said something quietly to my dad. Something procedural but firm. My dad nodded, though he looked like he barely understood. He lifted his binder with slow hands, then set it back down as if it suddenly weighed too much. The agent stepped aside to allow someone in. A man in a dark suit entered, mid-50s, carrying a legal pad. His expression was steady and grave. Daniel Cross, my dad's attorney. My dad straightened a little, as if recognizing an anchor in the storm. Daniel pulled out a chair. He did not smile. He did not offer comfort. He sat down slowly and placed his pen on the table. He looked at my dad with a kind of sorrow that came from knowing exactly how deep the trouble ran. Then Daniel said something I could read even without sound. "We need to talk now." Daniel sat across from my dad, the legal pad still untouched in front of him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. My dad kept waiting for someone to tell him this was a misunderstanding, that this was procedural, that this was an overreaction by overzealous agents. He kept glancing at the door as if expecting Ryan to appear and explain everything away. But Ryan was in custody, and the room was very quiet. Daniel finally opened the large evidence packet the agents had handed him. He didn't rush. He didn't sigh. He didn't mutter any of the familiar lawyer phrases my dad was used to hearing. He simply began reading, page by page, like a man preparing to walk someone through the wreckage of their own living room. My dad rubbed his forehead again. His eyes were red. His posture slumped. He wasn't angry anymore. He was lost, humiliated, grasping for a piece of solid ground. Daniel paused halfway through the first section of documents and tapped a finger against the page. My dad leaned forward, but Daniel did not hand him anything. He kept reading, slowly, deliberately. My dad fidgeted with the edge of his binder, but did not speak. The next few pages held copies of wire transfers, cross-referenced accounts, shipment logs, audit trails, the kind of evidence that did not need interpretation. It spoke for itself. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly as he reached the sections marked with red tabs. When he reached the last third of the packet, something in his face shifted. It wasn't a shock. It wasn't anger. It was something closer to recognition. He adjusted his glasses, looked down again, then looked at my dad. Not unkindly, not accusingly, just solemnly. My dad cleared his throat and asked what it said. His voice cracked on the last word. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He closed the packet halfway, keeping his hand resting on the page like he needed to steady himself. He looked at my dad the same way someone looks at a person who has stepped off a curb without checking for traffic. Slow. Measured. Then he spoke, barely above a whisper. "Sir, what have you done?" The words hung there, flat and heavy, and my dad blinked like he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Daniel reopened the packet with deliberate care, turning it so the top page faced him again. He tapped the header once with the back of his pen. "This is not a routine filing," he said. "It is a cooperation and immunity proposal, addressed directly to you." My dad frowned, still lost. Cooperation for what? Immunity from what? Daniel slid the next page forward. He pointed to the signature line without dramatics, without a lecture. My dad leaned closer. His eyes moved across the ink slowly, the way someone reads a name they already know, but cannot believe is actually in front of them. He whispered the first syllable of my name before his voice failed. Daniel continued. He explained that the document had been signed on December 31st at roughly 7:30 that evening. Signed by the lead forensic accountant who prepared it. Signed before the raid. Signed before the collapse. Signed while there was still time. Daniel slid his finger along the bottom of the page and positioned it so my dad could see. There, in unmistakable black ink, was my signature. The same signature my dad had seen on school forms, loan papers, scholarship offers. Only now it appeared on a federal document designed to keep him out of prison. My dad whispered he didn't understand. Daniel closed the packet halfway, keeping his hand on the edge like he needed to steady the weight of it. He spoke gently now, but not softly. "Sir, do you understand what your daughter was trying to do?" My dad just stared at him. Daniel answered his own question, because my dad couldn't. "She wasn't trying to trap you. She wasn't angry. She wasn't retaliating. She was trying to save you. That's why she brought the briefcase home. That's why she wanted to talk. She was going to offer you this deal quietly, privately, before agents had to get involved." My dad froze. The words landed inside him like something breaking open. He looked at Daniel as if waiting for permission to breathe, as if the truth coming from anyone else would hurt too much. Daniel didn't soften it. He repeated it. "She was trying to save you." My dad leaned back slowly, as if something heavy inside him had finally snapped loose. His eyes drifted to the ceiling, then to the wall, then back to the signature. His hands trembled slightly where they rested on the table. He whispered about the moment I had said, "all right," at dinner, when he grounded me in front of everyone. He said the word like it suddenly weighed more than he could hold. "All right," a calm, quiet answer he had dismissed as surrender. Now he saw it differently, as the moment he lost the chance to understand what I was actually carrying. He remembered the briefcase tucked at my side, the way I walked to my old bedroom without arguing, the long second I looked at him before turning away, the tone of my voice that he had decided was attitude. He remembered thinking he had established control. He understood now it had been closed. Daniel closed the folder gently and reminded him that none of this changed. The federal process. The agents had not raided his business because he was the mastermind. They had done so because he ignored signs, trusted the wrong person, and pushed away the one person who tried to warn him. If he had listened, even for a moment, the outcome would have been different. My dad pressed his shaking hands to his face. For a long time, he didn't move. When he finally lowered them, his voice was barely more than breath. "I need to see her." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even grief. It was a man realizing too late the truth his daughter had carried for him. Daniel nodded, but reminded him sternly that investigator contact was controlled. My dad didn't argue. He simply nodded again, small and stiff, like someone bracing for the next cold wave. His eyes drifted back to the cooperation pages, to my signature, to the date, to the quiet word he finally understood was not submission. It was goodbye. Daniel's voice still hung in the air when the agents re-entered the room, and by then, the shift inside my dad had already begun. I could feel it even through the muted video feed. Something had buckled, something old and rigid. Something he never imagined could be touched. But the investigation did not wait for emotional turning points. The wheels continued forward, and the aftermath began almost immediately. The morning after the raid, Chicago felt strangely bright. Too bright. I drove to the office with the sun hitting the windshield at a low angle, slicing across my vision in sharp bands. Everything around me looked completely normal. People walking their dogs, delivery trucks humming through intersections, a woman jogging with a cup of coffee balanced in her hand. It always startled me how the world kept moving while someone's life was collapsing in slow motion. When I reached the office, I barely had time to set my bag down before hearing someone call my name. It was Assistant United States Attorney Bryant. She asked if I had a minute. Her tone made it clear it wasn't a question. In her office, she handed me a printed statement. Several partner companies had already withdrawn their financial guarantees from my dad's business. Some had frozen accounts. One had suspended a multi-year contract pending further investigation. Another had officially severed ties. None of them mentioned the raid directly. They didn't need to. Language like reputational risk and breach of compliance said everything. I felt my stomach tighten, but not the way I expected. Not with guilt, not with triumph. Just a quiet, steady sadness. A business collapsing was not the same as a person collapsing, but it carried the same sound when it hit the ground. Bryant asked if I needed a moment. I told her no, not because I was being strong, because strength had nothing to do with it. It was simply too late for moments. Later that afternoon, I was asked to sit in on a meeting with Internal Affairs regarding my conflict review. The director, a man who rarely showed emotion, actually leaned back in his chair and studied me for several seconds before speaking. He told me that preliminary findings showed no breach, no inappropriate contact, no misconduct. He said I had followed protocol with precision despite personal proximity. He even said the word commendable, which he used maybe twice a year. Life wasn't the feeling I expected. Instead, there was a hollow ache, like surviving something you were never supposed to enjoy in the first place. A clean bill of integrity didn't erase the cost of earning it. I thanked him. He nodded. The meeting ended. By late afternoon, the emotional debris began to collect in places I couldn't avoid. My phone buzzed with a message from Elena, the first since New Year's Eve. She asked if we could talk. The text was short and uneven. Not angry, not accusatory, just tired. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met in a small park near the river, a place we used to visit when we were younger. She walked slowly toward me, arms wrapped around herself even though the weather was mild. Her hair looked uncombed. Her eyes were swollen. She sat on the bench without waiting for me to join her. She didn't speak at first. She watched the water. The boats drifted past. The sound of children playing in the distance. Finally, she said she had known something felt wrong. For months. Maybe longer. She said she'd heard Ryan talk on the phone late at night, using words she didn't understand. She said she'd ignored it. She said she kept telling herself she was imagining things. Her voice shook. She said she didn't want to lose him, that she had finally found someone who looked at her like she mattered. She admitted she had felt jealous that I had always been the one my dad counted on. The one he respected, the one he listened to when he was at his best. Then she said she'd stayed quiet when she shouldn't have, not because she believed Ryan, but because silence felt easier. I listened, not because her words healed anything, but because they were the closest she had ever come to honesty. I told her I knew what silence felt like. I had lived inside my own version of it for years, a silence of doing everything right just to keep the peace. A silence of letting family patterns run over me because calling them out meant being labeled dramatic or difficult. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat. She asked if Dad hated her. I said no. That wasn't how my dad operated. He didn't hate. He redirected. He rationalized. He rewrote events into shapes he could live with. She asked if I hated her. I said no again. Hate requires energy. What I felt was fatigue. A long, deep fatigue. She nodded as if she expected that answer. Then she asked the question she had been circling since she sat down. Why didn't you tell us? I looked at her. Really looked at her. Her uncertainty, her fear, her grief. And for the first time, I understood something I hadn't allowed myself to see before. Even if I had told her, she wouldn't have believed me. Not then. Not when Ryan was still the center of her world. Not when my dad still believed in the illusion of control. I would have been the difficult one again. The dramatic one. The one who always saw problems where others wanted peace. So I told her the truth. Because you wouldn't have listened. She flinched. Not out of anger. Out of recognition. We sat silently for a long time after that. When she finally stood, she didn't hug me. I didn't expect her to. Some wounds weren't meant to be touched. She walked away slowly, shoulders rounded forward like someone carrying pieces of a future she didn't know how to rebuild. When she disappeared around the corner, I felt my phone buzz again. A secure message. My dad's first formal update. Charges pending. Interview incomplete. Cooperation recommended. A short, cold summary of a man's life collapsing and recalibrating. I drove home as the city lights brightened. The air smelled faintly of snow, even though no storm was forecast. Chicago did that sometimes. It warned you about weather that never arrived. At home, I placed my keys on the counter and stood in the stillness. I didn't turn on the lights right away. The dimness felt more honest. My old family life had evaporated in less than a week. No dramatic explosion. No screaming matches, just a series of choices, misjudgments, loyalties misplaced, and truths ignored until they could not be ignored anymore. I had saved my dad legally. That much was true. I had given him a path forward. A slim one, but real. With cooperation and transparency, he could avoid the worst of the consequences. He could keep his freedom. He could rebuild something, even if it was smaller than before. But saving someone from legal ruin is not the same as saving a relationship. That part was already gone. The next morning, the FBI formally cleared me from conflict review and returned me to full status on the investigation, though only in oversight capacity. Necessary distance. Necessary boundaries. I stared at the notification longer than I needed to. Vindication didn't feel like victory. Later that day, I received one more voicemail. This one from my dad's attorney. He said my dad wanted to see me. The meeting would be arranged. The agents would be present. Nothing off the record. I listened to the message twice. Not because I was unsure, because the emotion threading through the background of his voice was familiar. Not guilt, not desperation. Grief. I sat down on my sofa, let my hands rest in my lap, and closed my eyes. Some things can be rebuilt. Some things are meant to break. And some things were never whole enough to begin with. It had taken a raid, an arrest, a national investigation, and the collapse of a family myth for my dad to finally see me clearly. And I realized then, with a quiet kind of ache, that even clarity could not fix what had already been worn thin beyond repair. There are things you can save with knowledge. But nothing can be saved without trust. And trust had been gone long before the agents arrived. He wanted to see me, and for a long moment, I just sat there in the quiet of my apartment, letting that sink in. The last time my dad had wanted anything from me, it had been obedience, a performance, a promise to bend myself back into the shape that kept his world comfortable. But this was different. There was no shape left for me to fit into. The old architecture of our family had already fallen. The meeting was arranged for the next morning at the Federal Building, a neutral room. No windows, a table too large for the number of people inside it. When I walked in, my dad was seated at the far end, Daniel beside him. 2 agents from my team sat near the door, silent observers. I took the chair opposite my dad, not beside him, opposite. Not as a punishment, as a boundary. He looked older, not by years, by impact. His hands were folded on the table, fingers intertwined tightly enough that his knuckles were pale. When he lifted his eyes to me, something inside them had changed. The sharpness that usually hid fear was gone. What remained was quieter, smaller. Humans. He said my name softly, not like a question, not like an accusation, just a recognition that he was finally seeing the person he had been speaking over for years. I waited. He gathered his breath like it hurt. Then he said he was sorry. He didn't rush. He didn't dramatize. He didn't try to explain away his choices or rewrite what had happened at the New Year's dinner. He apologized for the grounding, for the humiliation, for believing Ryan so easily, for turning my calmness into defiance, for thinking silence meant consent. He didn't cry. That almost made it harder. He spoke slowly, in the same measured voice he used when he talked about things he regretted from his childhood, as if the words had to be handled carefully or they might break. I listened, not because I needed the apology, but because he needed to say it. When he finished, he looked down at his hands again. He said he understood if I didn't forgive him. He said he knew he had failed me in ways he hadn't even recognized until then. Agents showed him the truth he refused to see. He said he wished he had listened. Not last week, not last month. Years ago. For the first time in a long time, I believed him. But an apology does not restore what was lost. It only names it. I told him I had not been trying to punish him. I had not been trying to embarrass him. I had not been trying to hurt him. I told him I had been trying to save him. And when he pushed me out of the house that night, something in me finally stopped trying. He nodded slowly, as if each word deserved space. I told him that what happened with Ryan was not his fault alone. Manipulators thrive in spaces where truth is uncomfortable and loyalty is expected. But trusting the wrong person was not the same as trusting no one else. He had chosen Ryan's voice over mine, repeatedly. That choice had consequences. He swallowed hard. His eyes glistened, but he didn't look away. I told him that I was not returning to the family role I used to occupy. The fixer. The quiet one. The daughter who absorbed everything so the household could keep functioning. I told him those days were gone. permanently. His breath hitched just slightly. I told him I would continue to help legally where permitted. I would not sabotage him. I would not withdraw documentation, but I would not rescue him emotionally. I would not hold his guilt for him. That weight was his. Daniel listened without interrupting. My dad finally asked the question I had been waiting for. Can we ever go back to the way it was? Not a plea, a wondering. I told him the truth. The way it was had never worked for me. When he opened them again, something in his face looked steadier. Acceptance is a quiet thing. It takes root slowly. He asked if there could be a new way instead, a different kind of relationship. Not father to child, just two adults trying again with honesty this time. I didn't answer right away. I looked at him, at the man who had defined so much of my childhood, the man who had taught me discipline and budgeting and how to change a tire, the man who had also taught me how small a daughter could feel when her voice was inconvenient. I told him, maybe. Not today. Not this week. Not while legal decisions hovered overhead like low clouds. But maybe if he did his part, if he owned his choices, if he rebuilt trust not through apologies, but through consistent, quiet repair. He nodded. And for the first time, I saw something in his expression that startled me. Respect. The meeting ended when the agents stepped forward. Procedure resumed. Daniel began discussing cooperation options, timelines, plea possibilities. My dad listened with the focus of someone who had finally stopped pretending. The cliff wasn't there. As for me, I walked out of the building feeling the cold air hit my face like a reset button. I breathed in deeply. The city noise felt clearer than usual, more precise, like I was finally myself acceptable to people who wanted the version of me that didn't exist. The following weeks unfolded with a strange mix of order and uncertainty. My dad entered formal cooperation negotiations. Some charges were reduced. Others were still pending. Legal processes moved slower than grief, and both were happening at the same time. Mom called a few times, not to beg or guilt, just to tell me she was taking things day by day. Her voice held a kind of softness I hadn't heard in years. It was uncomfortable at first, then oddly grounding. Elena and I exchanged a few messages. Not closeness, not distance, just something new, fragile and real. Ryan stayed in custody awaiting indictment. I did not think about him often, not out of forgiveness, out of disinterest. His story was over, mine. My own work shifted to a new case. The internal clearance restored my role fully, but the experience had changed the way people looked at me in the corridors. Not with suspicion, with a kind of sober respect, like they suddenly understood the difference between strength and endurance. Some nights I found myself replaying the moment at the dinner table when my dad grounded me. His voice, sharp and dismissive. The laughter. The sting of public humiliation wrapped in parental authority. And then my quiet response. All right. It had taken weeks for me to understand the truth buried inside that word. I didn't agree to the punishment. I wasn't giving up. I was letting go. Being grounded had not taken away my freedom. It had returned it. It marked the exact moment I stopped living in the version of my family they needed me to inhabit, and stepped into the life I had built on my own terms. A life defined not by their expectations, but by my boundaries. And in a strange way, the raid, the collapse, the unraveling of everything we thought was untouchable had given me something I never expected. Clarity, agency, and a kind of peace that wasn't loud, but steady. I still don't know what future my dad and I will have. Maybe we will rebuild something small but honest. Maybe we will drift politely in and out of each other's lives. Maybe we will stand in the same room someday without carrying the weight of everything that broke between us. But whatever comes next, it will be real, not performance, not an obligation. Not silence masquerading as harmony, just the truth. And if there is one lesson in all of this, it is that truth, spoken quietly and without apology, can be the loudest kind of revenge. If you've ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you're listening from.